They said my flood channels were an eyesore. They said winter runoff wasn't a real threat. So the HOA filled in the trenches I'd spent years building, the same ones that protected this neighborhood from the violent melt cycles we get every spring. They didn't care that I was a retired flood engineer. They didn't care that I lost my daughter to a flash flood 12 years ago. They only cared about their precious landscaping rules. So they buried my warnings. But when the thaw came early, when the snow turned to water and the rain accelerated everything nature came for their pride, the ground beneath their perfect parking lot crumbled. The asphalt sank. And Karen's luxury SUV, it floated once, then vanished into the hole they swore would never exist. I didn't have to say a word. The water said it all. By the first week of December, the snow had already buried my yard under nearly 2 feet of heavy sodden accumulation. It wasn't the light, fluffy kind that children dream of for building snowmen, no. This was dense and moisture-laden, piling up in thick drifts that swallowed the edges of fences and turned every pathway into a treacherous slog. Each morning, the sky remained stubbornly low and gray, like a heavy lid pressed down on the world, trapping the biting cold and adding yet another fresh layer to the frozen terrain. In a valley neighborhood like Alder Ridge, in the quiet city of Fairhill, winter never arrived gently. It seized control, transforming the landscape into something raw and unforgiving. The true threat, however, always waited patiently for spring, the rapid thaw that could unleash all that pent-up water in a sudden, overwhelming surge. I live alone in a modest, ranch-style house at 1124 Alder Ridge Drive, a simple home with a backyard that slopes gently upward toward a thickly wooded hill. For years, natural runoff from those higher elevations has followed predictable routes down through my property, etching faint paths in the soil during milder seasons. When handled properly, it posed no issue, a steady flow that simply passed through. But mishandle it, or pretend it didn't exist, and it could become a destructive force rushing with the power of a freight train unleashed. That's why, over a decade ago, I constructed a reliable system of winter runoff channels, subtle, low-profile swales, and shallow trenches carefully designed to guide the thaw torrent safely away from my foundation along the fence line and directly into the municipal drainage ditch alongside the road. They weren't meant to be eye-catching. They were functional, born from experience and necessity. In my earlier career with the Army Corps of Engineers serving across the Pacific Northwest, I had contributed to designing emergency flood response systems in the wake of brutal spring storms that devastated entire communities. I learned the language of water intimately, how it gathers in hidden reservoirs, probes for vulnerabilities, and then strikes without warning, claiming everything in its path. But the harshest education came from a personal tragedy that no training could have prepared me for: the loss of my daughter, Alyssa. She was just 16, vibrant and full of dreams, when she spent a weekend at a friend's house in a poorly planned canyon development. A flash flood descended in under 7 minutes, turning a dry wash into a raging torrent. By the time emergency teams arrived, it was too late. That day shattered my world and forever altered how I viewed any landscape. From then on, I treated water with the reverence it demanded, as a force that was very much alive, patient, relentless, and capable of unimaginable destruction if not respected. Every winter since moving to Fairhill, I've maintained those channels with quiet dedication. Bundled against the cold in my thick parka, I'd venture out at first light, shovel in hand, pushing through knee-deep powder to keep the contours clear and effective. I'd deepen the main diversion line, carve additional spillways for potential overflow, and verify the precise gradient using a trusted water level. It was methodical work rooted in old habits that refused to fade. Neighbors occasionally passed by, offering that familiar suburban acknowledgement, a brief nod and polite smile that often concealed curiosity or quiet disapproval, as if my efforts marked me as eccentric. I never sought their understanding or praise. This wasn't about them. It was about honoring a promise to myself forged in grief to stand vigilant against the dangers I'd failed to prevent once before. This year, the snow carried an especially ominous quality from the start, heavier and wetter than usual, falling in relentless sheets that saturated the ground before it could fully harden. Beneath the surface, dangerous ice lenses formed, trapping vast amounts of moisture that would release all at once when temperatures rose. I sensed the building risk intuitively, the way one feels an approaching storm in aching joints. So I redoubled my efforts working in solitary silence, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of metal on snow and the distant hum of plows on the main road. In those moments alone with the cold memories of Alyssa would surface vividly her playful complaints about my obsessive digging during family visits, her bright eyes sparkling with mischief. The pain never dulled, but it fueled my resolve. I dug not just for the house or the neighborhood, but for the fragile sense of control in a world that had once proven how quickly everything could be swept away. Because I knew the thaw was inevitable. And when it came, it would test everything. My preparations, the land's hidden weaknesses, and the willingness of those around me to heed warnings they couldn't yet see. One bitterly cold morning, as I chipped away at the ice glazing my windshield, a flash of color caught my eye against the monochrome snow. Taped securely to my front door was a laminated violation notice fluttering faintly in the wind like an official decree I had no interest in obeying. It bore the Alder Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead, complete with the elegant community logo that now seemed more ironic than inviting. I brought it inside, my fingers numb, despite the gloves, and unfolded it under the bright kitchen light. The language was cold and impersonal, laced with legal precision. Violation Notice Section 3.18. Unapproved modifications to landscape affecting community visual standards. In essence, my carefully engineered runoff channels were labeled unauthorized trenching or structural earthworks, accused of disrupting the neighborhood's precious aesthetic cohesion. I had precisely 14 days to eradicate them, filling in every contour and restoring the yard to a pristine uniform grade, or face fines and enforced compliance. Aesthetics throw aesthetic cohesion. The term struck me as absurd. In our current reality, snow piles towering along the curbs, streaked with grime from road salt. Skeletal trees clawing at the overcast sky. Driveways turned into slippery hazards. If there was any cohesion in Alder Ridge right now, it was the shared brutality of winter, unforgiving, unapologetic, and far from picturesque. Signed at the bottom in sharp, confident penmanship. Karen Whitford, HOA chairwoman. Her name evoked instant recognition. Karen resided in an imposing red-bricked colonial on Maple Crest Lane just 2 streets away. A home that always looked impeccably staged with white shutters framing large windows and holiday decorations arranged with catalog-perfect symmetry. Since she assumed the chairwoman role in 2018, she had elevated the HOA from a mundane oversight body into a tightly controlled regime. Rules weren't flexible guidelines to her. They were absolute laws policed with unwavering zeal. Stories circulated about her driveway, inspections, her prompt emails citing minor infractions, and her ability to detect a shade-off in fence stain from blocks away. Yet I clung to a sliver of optimism that this might be a simple error, perhaps an overzealous new member misapplying the bylaws. That same afternoon, I trudged through the deepening snow to the community building adjacent to the recreation center, where the HOA kept a modest office space. The wind whipped sharply, stinging my cheeks as I followed the plowed path. The receptionist, a harried young woman surrounded by towering stacks of files and holiday planning notebooks, greeted me with a strained smile. "How can I assist you today?" "I'm following up on this violation notice," I explained, placing the document on the counter. "It's about functional runoff channels in my yard. I'd like to discuss it with Karen Whitford, if possible." She scanned the page quickly before checking her computer. "The chairwoman is tied up in meetings. You can submit a dispute response form for formal review." I accepted the form and settled into a stiff chair in the lobby, pen in hand. Methodically, I detailed my position, the channel's critical role in managing hill runoff, attached photographs showing the yard before and after snow cover, annotated diagrams of flow gradients, and excerpts from the City of Fair Hills official floodplain maps, highlighting our area's vulnerability to rapid thaw events. I stapled everything together and returned it. "It will go to the board for consideration," she assured me neutrally. No follow-up ever came, no acknowledgement, no questions, no indication that my evidence had even been glanced at. 3 days later, emerging with my steaming coffee, I discovered bright orange stakes driven into the snow at regular intervals, marking the exact boundaries of my swales like targets. A survey crew had visited in my absence, preparing for what came next. The message was clear, dialogue was over. As the weak winter sun crested the hills, casting long shadows across the drifts, a subtle sound reached me from the distant woods, a faint, almost melodic trickle of early melt high above. It was innocuous now, a mere hint of movement, but I recognized it for what it was, the first whisper of the storm to come. That morning, shortly after 8, I watched her approach from the sidewalk, Karen Whitford, cutting a striking figure in her trademark red wool coat heels, navigating the ice with defiant precision. Clipboard in hand, she moved with purpose, her gaze fixed on my property, as if assessing a battlefield. I met her at the lawn's edge, coffee mug warming my palms against the chill. "Mr. Hargrove," she stated flatly, dispensing with any greeting. "I'm addressing the persistent violation, the unauthorized earthworks." "The runoff channels," I replied calmly. She glanced at her notes. "Complaints have been lodged regarding their appearance and safety hazards. They violate landscaping standards. The board's vote was unanimous. You have 7 days to backfill them." Her tone brooked no debate, as if functionality were irrelevant next to appearance. "These aren't for show, Karen. They're designed to divert thaw surge from the hill. I've included the risk assessments in my submission. Did you review them?" "Guidelines override personal modifications," she countered smoothly. "Uniformity maintains our community's value and order." "I've prevented issues for years," I pressed. "Without them, water pools and spreads basements flood sidewalks, erode. Is that worth protecting order?" Her lips thinned. "If everyone altered their yards arbitrarily, we'd have anarchy. Follow procedure or the HOA will contract the restoration at your expense." She pivoted abruptly, heels tapping away, leaving a trail of footprints that the wind would soon erase. In the days that followed, my mailbox overflowed with escalating reminders, policy excerpts, violation timelines, detailed fine structures, all bearing that distinctive Karen Doublewalt signature. It was a paper siege intended to erode resolve, but I'd weathered worse storms. As fresh snow continued to blanket Fairhill, I pored over my maps, late into the nights tracing potential flow paths under lamplight. Water followed physics, not politics, and physics, unlike people, always won in the end. The barrage of notices continued unabated in the days after Karen's visit, each one slipping into my mailbox like another layer of frost on an already burdened roof. Glossy reminders quoting obscure HOA covenants, detailed schedules of accumulating fines, and emphatic declarations about the sacred need for visual uniformity across the community, it all stamped with that impeccable Karen W. All flourish. It was a calculated assault on paper meant to grind down opposition through persistence and threat. But I'd stared down forces far more relentless than administrative harassment. Floods didn't send warnings, they simply arrived. Refusing to yield quietly, I resolved to make one last direct appeal to the board. That Friday evening, I drove to the community hall for the scheduled HOA meeting, the tires of my truck crunching over packed snow in the parking lot that would soon become infamous. Inside the room hummed with low conversation under the glare of buzzing fluorescent lights. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table at the front where a meager tray of supermarket cookies gathered dust. The familiar faces assembled Dale, ever the optimist, with his endless enthusiasm for lawn ornaments. Linda, vigilant as always in her neighborhood watch role. And presiding over it all, Karen Whitford, poised with her clipboard and an air of unchallenged authority. The meeting plodded through routine matters, approvals for holiday light displays, debates over the rec center's maintenance budget until the floor opened for resident comments. I raised my hand promptly and stood when called upon. "I need to address the violation regarding my runoff channels." I began, my voice steady amid the sudden quiet. "This isn't just about my yard. Removing them endangers several properties downhill during the thaw." Karen adjusted her posture, a faint sigh escaping her lips. "Mr. Hargrove, we've covered this. Individual disputes should be handled through written channels, not open forum." I held my ground. "With all due respect, the board's decision impacts public safety. I've submitted documentation, photos, flow data, city floodplain references. These channels have prevented flooding for years." Whispers stirred among the attendees. Eyes darted between me and the head table. Dale fidgeted with his pen, while Linda leaned in, intrigued. Karen conferred briefly with the others before conceding with a tight nod. "Fine, 2 minutes." I produced a set of laminated images and held them up for the room to see, one capturing a previous thaw, with water flowing cleanly through the swales toward the ditch, harmless and contained. This system diverts surge from the wooded hill behind my lot. Our infrastructure can't handle unchecked volume. The municipal ditch overflows quickly. In 2019, number 218 nearly lost their basement to exactly this kind of backup. Repairs topped $8,000. A few nods rippled through the chairs. Someone muttered agreement about the mess that year, pump trucks idling for days, soggy furniture piled on curbs. Karen dismissed it with a wave. Your initiative is noted, but unapproved alterations violate policy. The board stands firm. Compliance is non-negotiable. Linda spoke up unexpectedly, her tone probing. Hold on, that 2019 flood at 218 was bad. Are we sure ignoring proven mitigation is wise? Karen's glare could have iced over the windows. This discussion is about standards, not revisiting old incidents. Meeting moves on. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but palpable appearance trumped reality. Pretty lawns over practical safety. I collected my materials and left before adjournment, the door closing behind me with a finality that echoed in the cold night. 3 mornings later, the sound of engines shattered the dawn stillness. From my kitchen window, coffee in hand, I watched a compact excavator and a pair of contractors maneuver onto my lawn, their bright vests stark against the snow. They'd wasted no time, gravel already tumbling from the bucket into my primary swale, erasing years of careful engineering one load at a time. I bolted outside, breath clouding furiously. Stop, what the hell are you doing? The lead worker approached, clipboard extended like a shield. HOA work order, sir. Backfill and regrade for compliance. Restore to uniform specs. I snatched the form, scanning the damning details, my address directives for eliminating unsightly disruptions, costs to be billed to the homeowner. These aren't decorations, they're flood diversion. Filling them redirects water everywhere. Basements, driveways, the whole lower block. He shrugged, genuine regret flickering in his eyes. We're contractors. We do what the order says. No anger toward them. They were tools like the machines rumbling behind. When this causes damage, and it will, your signatures are here. Remember that. They resumed, methodical and efficient. I stood frozen as the bucket scooped and poured, burying contours I'd shaped through countless winters. Gravel cascaded, followed by fresh sod rolled out like a deceptive blanket. By afternoon, the yard looked flawless, smooth, innocent, hiding the vulnerability beneath. That evening in the dim living room, I sat watching snow sift silently past the window. My safeguards were gone, interred under enforced ignorance. The dread settled deep, a familiar ache reminding me of losses past. I added fresh documentation to my files, photos of the destruction, the work order copy, precise timestamps. Then, turning to my computer, I drafted a message not to the HOA, but to the City of Fairhill Engineering Department, to Tom Griggs, a former colleague from mitigation efforts. The thaw lingered on the horizon, patient as ever. But now, with no guides left, the water would chart its own destructive course, and no one could claim they hadn't been warned. Sleep evaded me the night after the contractors left, burying my life's work under layers of gravel and sod. It wasn't the physical labor that exhausted me. It was the deeper kind, the gnawing vigilance that hummed beneath the skin when you knew disaster loomed and everyone else remained blind to it. In the darkness, old memories resurfaced, uninvited, grainy rescue footage. From my core days, rivers swallowing bridges, families stranded on rooftops, and always cutting through it all, Alyssa's face, pale, trusting, gone in a heartbeat because someone somewhere had dismissed the warnings. By morning, I was back at my dining table, maps and data spread out like a war room. Alder Ridge sat in a natural basin fed by 2 main elevation drops, one from the wooded hill directly behind my property, the other from a paved swale curving off Maple Street. The neighborhood had been developed in the early 2000s with only minimal stormwater planning, basic curbs, and a single municipal ditch that everyone assumed would suffice. The city's own risk maps labeled us marginally vulnerable to rapid thaw events. Marginal. The word had always irked me. It sounded so innocuous, so manageable. But I'd seen marginal turn catastrophic when preparation failed. The science was straightforward, with snowpack water content pushing past 35% and ground still partially frozen. Any sustained rise above freezing would trigger massive surface runoff. Water would sheet across the impermeable soil, gaining speed downhill, seeking the lowest points. Without my channels to intercept and redirect it, the flow would fan out unpredictably, pooling in yards, overwhelming curbs, and converging on the weakest infrastructure. I compiled everything anew, updated charts, personal soil tests, even thermal images from a drone I'd flown 2 winters prior, capturing heat signatures and early melt patterns across the blocks. Then I drafted a formal letter to the City of Fairhill Engineering Office, addressing it directly to Thomas Griggs, a steady, knowledgeable engineer I'd collaborated with during a community hazard workshop years earlier. Subject urgent: HOA interference, creating flood hazard in Alder Ridge. Dear Tom, I hope this finds you well. I'm reaching out about a developing risk at 1124 Alder Ridge Drive. The local HOA has recently ordered the destruction of functional runoff diversion channels on my property channels that have safely managed hill surge for over a decade. Attached topographic maps, historical flow data pre- and post-backfill photos, thaw forecasts, and video evidence from past events. This action removes critical mitigation impacting not just my home, but downhill properties and community areas. I request an immediate city review to prevent potential damage during the impending thaw. Best regards, Gavin Hargrove. I hit send at dawn as golden light first touched the snow-laden rooftops. Relief mixed with frustration. The city moved deliberately, and time was slipping away. But Karen operated on her own accelerated timeline. By midday, another notice arrived, bolder underlined in red laced with veiled legal threats. It accused me of escalating to external authorities and disrupting community harmony under some obscure section. I nearly laughed at the irony. They were threatening me for trying to protect the harmony of dry basements and intact foundations. Fury propelled me straight to the HOA office. The door was locked naturally, but I knocked with purpose. Karen opened it herself, her expression a mask of composed victory. "You need to see the data I sent the city," I said without preamble, voice low and controlled. "If the thaw hits hard, and it will, this falls on you." "We followed every procedure," she replied coolly. "You did not. It's not procedure when lives and property are at stake. This is negligence." Her smile was thin, triumphant. "No other residents have complained. They will, I warned. When their garages fill and insurance denies claims because of obstructed drainage." The door closed firmly in my face. 2 days later, the weather betrayed us all. Temperatures spiked unexpectedly, climbing to the mid-40s and holding steady even overnight. The next morning, the air carried a new sound, a pervasive hiss as snow began to surrender its grip. I stepped outside to inspect thin rivulets already traced across my flattened yard, where channels once guided them safely away. Now the water wandered freely, saturating the new sod, seeping toward low corners and spilling onto the sidewalk. By afternoon, the lower backyard glistened with standing runoff creeping inexorably toward the fence and beyond. It edged down the gentle slope of Alder Ridge Drive, merging with flows from neighboring lots, gathering momentum as it approached the Birch Street intersection. I documented relentlessly video from my porch timestamps measurements with a simple ruler in the puddles. A second email to Tom Griggs followed with attachments showing the early signs. At 3:16 p.m., the clearest omen appeared: the municipal ditch along the road brimmed, full, overflowing its banks, despite it being only the second day of significant melt. Needing perspective, I drove the block slowly. Sheets of water coursed across Maple Street, pooling in driveways and dipping toward garages. But the sight that chilled me deepest was the HOA parking lot near the rec center. A flat expanse where Karen had proudly removed drainage grates the previous spring for cleaner lines and better aesthetics. Now a broad stream diverted from the slope behind the building, flowing straight onto the asphalt. 6 inches deep in places, it spread without hindrance. No trenches, no grates, no escape. Just a growing mirror of muddy water reflecting the gray sky, inching toward parked cars. And there, near the entrance, stood Karen, arms crossed, watching the inexorable advance with an expression I couldn't quite read from afar. I pulled alongside and lowered my window. "Still convinced this is about looks?" I called. She met my gaze but said nothing. I nodded toward the expanding pool. "You're about to see how quickly cohesion dissolves." As I drove away, the first warm droplets of an unforecasted rain began to fall, pattering on the windshield like impatient fingers. The thaw wasn't easing. It was accelerating. And the water, freed from all restraint, was finally choosing its own path straight toward the heart of everything the HOA had tried to control. The thaw didn't ease up. It intensified with a vengeance that felt almost personal. Temperatures lingered in the high 40s through the night, and by the fifth day, the neighborhood had transformed into a slick, saturated mess. What remained of the snowpack slumped into heavy slush, collapsing from rooftops in sudden thunderous avalanches that shook windows and startled sleeping birds into flight. The ground beneath was no longer frozen solid. It had become a spongy, over-soaked mat that squelched underfoot, releasing the sharp, earthy scent of awakening soil mixed with the metallic tang of melting ice. Water seeks the path of least resistance. That's one of the first truths any engineer learns. And thanks to the HOA's relentless pursuit of perfection, every natural or engineered path had been systematically erased. My buried channels, the sealed grates in the rec center slope, the removed spillways all gone in the name of visual appeal. Now the runoff surged unchecked, fanning across lawns like dark veins spreading through pale skin. I'd spent the previous night checking my discreet cameras mounted under the eaves, their footage revealing the steady creep water pooling in unnatural patterns due to the regraded yards seeping under siding, probing garage doors, and inching toward foundations. No word from the HOA. No alerts, no apologies. Not even a hint of concern. Silence from those who'd enforced the changes, as if denial could hold back gravity. Early that morning around 10:30, the first major crack appeared. I was out walking the block with my phone in hand, filming the growing streams for documentation, when I noticed it. In the HOA parking lot, a thin fissure snaking along the asphalt's southern edge, right where an old drainage grate had once been, covered over with decorative bricks. Up close, the sound was eerie, a low bubbling gurgle from below, like something alive stirring in the depths. The subgrade was washing out, undermined by days of relentless flow with nowhere to vent. I hurried to the HOA office door and knocked hard, locked as expected. Karen opened it after a moment, looking weary in a simple beige sweater, sleeves pushed up as if she'd been shuffling papers in a futile attempt at normalcy. The red coat was nowhere in sight. "We're handling internal matters," she said curtly. "This isn't a good time, Mr. Hargrove." I held up my phone, the video playing clearly. "Your lot's developing a void. Runoff's eroding the base. You have hours, maybe less, before it collapses." She glanced at the screen, her face tightening, then looked away. "If you're here to say, 'I told you so,' I'm here to give you a chance to mitigate. Call the city now, request sandbags, reopen the drains. Act fast, and you might save the building." Her voice sharpened. "This is private property. You're not authorized to inspect or dictate. It's basic hydraulics, Karen, not bylaws." She stepped back and shut the door firmly, the click echoing like a final judgment. I didn't waste more time. Back home, I hauled out my remaining sandbags from the garage remnants from old disaster kits and lined them along my lower boundary, steering what I could away from vulnerable spots. It wasn't enough to stop the inevitable, but it might buy a few homes some breathing room. By early afternoon, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, the air growing thick and humid, laced with the musty odor of thawing earth. Then came the rain-warm, unseasonal drops that hammered down without warning, accelerating the melt like fuel on flames. Each splash on the snowpack released torrents, turning gentle trickles into roaring streams. Standing at my driveway's edge, I watched rivulets race across the street, merging into broader flows that spun debris in frantic eddies. One breached my sandbags and hurried along the curb. Another slipped under a neighbor's fence. My eyes followed their path downhill to the HOA lot. The fissure had widened dramatically now, a gaping 3-inch chasm, stretching 20 feet with muddy water churning visibly beneath. Chunks of asphalt broke loose and vanished into the swirl. Then a deep, ominous crack split the air like ice fracturing on a frozen lake. The pavement groaned under the strain. The center sagged inward. And suddenly, as if a drain plug had been yanked free, a large section collapsed entirely. Asphalt buckled and folded, plunging into a vortex of churning mud and water. The hole expanded rapidly, swallowing decorative stones, the small garden bed Karen had championed, and then cars. They shifted one by one, tires losing traction on the slick surface. A silver SUV teetered, then slid sideways into the pit. Others followed, bumpers dipping, alarms blaring briefly before silencing under the flood. Karen's Lexus went dramatically rolling forward, with agonizing slowness, front end tipping into the abyss, glass shattering as it twisted and submerged in frothy brown. From across the lot, her scream pierced the rain, high, raw, utterly shattered. She stood near the rec center steps, walkie-talkie dangling uselessly, face drained of color. For the first time, the unbreakable chairwoman looked small, vulnerable, utterly undone. Water roared through the breach, now carving deeper, spreading across the lower elevation toward Birch Street. Bricks from the retaining wall tumbled like toys. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as city crews raced in, but they could only contain, not reverse. One engineer, jumping from his truck, surveyed the chaos and muttered to a colleague, "Undermined completely. No drainage venting the pressure." This was waiting to happen. I filmed it all phone steady despite the downpour soaking me through. Called 911 with calm precision. Structural collapse at Alder Ridge HOA lot. Active flooding from thaw runoff. Multiple vehicles involved. As fire trucks and public works barricaded the area, floodlights cutting through the gloom, the parking lot transformed into a churning lake. The HOA's pride reduced to a hazardous crater. Neighbors gathered on porches, stunned into silence, phones capturing the spectacle. Whispers spread, they filled in Gavin's ditches. Karen ordered the grates sealed. That evening, amid the flashing lights and relentless rain, Tom Griggs called. "Gavin," he said gravely, "your documentation was spot on. Engineers on site confirm your channels would have diverted enough to prevent the washout." "I know," I replied quietly. "Stop work order issuing tomorrow. Full inquiry incoming." Hanging up, I stepped outside once more. The scene glowed under emergency lights, water still rising, reflecting red and blue strobes. Karen sat on a stranger's car hood, wrapped in a foil blanket, staring at her submerged Lexus. No satisfaction stirred in me, only bone-deep weariness. Nature couldn't be buried or bullied, and now everyone saw the cost of trying. The collapse didn't end with the parking lot's dramatic surrender. It rippled outward like the very waves it had unleashed, reshaping the neighborhood in ways no one could have anticipated. By nightfall, emergency crews had cordoned off the entire area around the rec center and HOA office, their floodlights casting harsh beams across the churning water that now filled the crater. The pit had deepened to over 10 feet, in places a swirling cauldron of mud debris and half-submerged vehicles. Asphalt fragments floated like broken icebergs, and the once meticulous landscaping, those prized flower beds and decorative walls, lay scattered and ruined, testament to how swiftly order could dissolve. Sirens wailed intermittently as public works teams worked to pump out excess water and stabilize the edges. But every effort seemed to reveal more erosion beneath. One firefighter, shaking his head as he coiled a hose, confided to a bystander, "This wasn't just bad luck. No proper venting blocked flows. It's like they invited the ground to give way." Neighbors clustered in small groups along the barricades, coats pulled tight against the persistent rain, their faces illuminated by phone screens as they recorded the scene. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to outright conversations. Gavin tried to warn them. He sent all those maps and videos. Karen wouldn't listen, said it ruined the look. I stood at the perimeter, soaked to the bone, but unwilling to leave my phone, still capturing footage for the record. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel, heavy with the finality of consequences long ignored. Across the chaos, I spotted Karen again, huddled under a foil blanket on the steps of the rec center, her usual poise shattered. She stared blankly at the spot where her Lexus had vanished. The vehicle now just another casualty in the brown depths. No clipboard, no authoritative stance, just a woman confronting the wreckage of her convictions. The next morning, despite the ongoing cleanup, word spread faster than the floodwaters is ever had. A local news van from Channel 8 arrived early, tires splashing through lingering puddles, as the reporter, a sharp-eyed young woman with a bright raincoat, navigated the barricades. She moved with purpose, microphone in hand, interviewing shell-shocked residents and city workers. Someone pointed her my way. "Mr. Gavin Hargrove?" she asked, approaching with her cameraman in tow. I nodded cautiously, wiping rain from my face. "That's me. We've heard you submitted warnings to the city about this exact risk. Would you be willing to speak on camera?" I hesitated, glancing at the devastation behind her, the caution tape fluttering like surrender flags, the backhoe idly digging at the crater's edge. This wasn't about personal triumph. "Yes," I said finally, "but not for credit. For everyone who'll have to live with the aftermath." They set up quickly under a shared umbrella, the light panel harsh against the gray dawn. She started with basics, how long I'd lived here, my background with the Corps. I spoke plainly about past floods I'd managed, the lessons from the Northwest storms. Then, inevitably, about Alyssa, her name catching slightly in my throat, as I described how her death in that flash flood had changed everything. "Why do you think the HOA dismissed your concerns?" the reporter pressed gently. I looked directly into the lens, rain dripping from my brow. "Because some people mistake control for wisdom. Karen saw functional channels and called them ugly. I saw them and remembered the day water took my daughter. We weren't prioritizing the same thing's appearance over prevention. And now the ground itself has settled the argument." The segment aired that evening, my words clipped into a tight package alongside drone footage of the sinkhole and interviews with bewildered neighbors. Suddenly, the story wasn't just local. It was viral in Fair Hill circles, shared across community groups and social media. My phone began buzzing with notifications, texts from numbers I didn't recognize, emails from residents I'd barely spoken to. The first knock came from Dave, the young father at 214, whose garage I'd helped protect with that midnight emergency trench. He stood on my porch with a thermos of coffee and gratitude in his eyes. "You saved us that night, Gavin. Karen never said a word about what they'd done to your yard. If you'd listened to her fines instead." More followed. Sharon, the elderly widow down the block, brought homemade muffins and stories of how she'd always admired my thoughtful landscaping. Even Dale stopped by deflated inflatables, forgotten admitting he'd voted with the board out of habit, but now saw the folly. They weren't just thankful, they were incensed. The narrative shifted overnight from eccentric old man with ditches to the voice of reason ignored. Online forums lit up with scanned copies of my old submissions, side-by-side photos of the channels versus the collapse. "HOA ignores expert warning, pays the price," became a headline. Karen attempted damage control the following day, calling a virtual emergency board meeting since the physical space was inaccessible. I joined anonymously, camera off just to observe. She appeared on screen in a crisp blazer, hair perfectly styled, but the strain showed in the faint shadows under her eyes. "We've adhered to all protocols," she insisted, voice steady but thinner than before. No one could predict such an extreme thaw. The city shares responsibility for infrastructure maintenance. But the chat exploded with dissent. Residents typed furiously, "Gavin warned you weeks ago. He showed the models why bury his channels. This cost us all insurance, hikes incoming." Names were invoked repeatedly, mine chief among them. Questions flew: why ignore the engineer's data? Why prioritize aesthetics over documented risks? By the meeting's end, a motion surfaced to suspend Karen pending a full review. She didn't fight it long. Halfway through the vote tally, her feed went dark. She simply disconnected. In that moment, the throne she'd built on rules and appearances cracked as thoroughly as the parking lot. Change was coming, swift, unavoidable, and long overdue. And for the first time, the neighborhood was listening not to the loudest voice, but to the one that had understood the water all along. The fallout from the collapse spread far beyond the physical crater in the parking lot. It cracked open the foundations of trust within Alder Ridge, exposing fault lines that had been papered over for years. In the days immediately following, the city wasted no time asserting oversight. 2 days after the sinkhole claimed its victims, I found myself at the Fair Hill City Hall Annex, a thick manila envelope heavy in my hands. Inside were the fruits of my vigilance, every ignored warning, every map, every time-stamped photo and video copies of the HOA notices, even the email where Karen had once dismissed my channels as unsightly and unnecessary. What had begun as a private battle now carried the weight of public record, a clear case of private governance overreaching into safety territory. The Risk Management Division had summoned me for a voluntary debrief, but the room felt anything but casual. A small team awaited city engineers with rolled blueprints, insurance adjusters poring over liability forms, and a legal representative from public safety. The atmosphere was professional, charged with the quiet intensity of people piecing together how preventable tragedy had nearly escalated further. "Mr. Hargrove," began the lead engineer, a thoughtful man with wire-rimmed glasses, "your submissions predicted this almost precisely, the washout points, the flow volumes, even the timing within hours. It's some of the most thorough resident documentation we've seen. I placed the envelope on the table. This adds the rest, the HOA's orders, the backfill work logs, the dispute denials. They sifted through it carefully. One adjuster paused on the side-by-side photos, my channels intact, versus the flattened yard post contractor. Another highlighted the floodplain overlays I'd annotated. Questions came steadily. How long had the system been operational? 11 years, maintained seasonally, 0 incidents. Had the HOA provided any engineering justification for removal? None, just citations for aesthetics. This is our third HOA case this year, pushing boundaries on safety modifications, the risk manager admitted with a sigh. But yours is the most comprehensively evidenced. It could set precedent. I nodded, the weight of Alyssa's memory steadying me. I didn't compile this for precedent. I did it because I've buried a child to flash flooding once. I wasn't going to stand by while negligence risked more. The room fell respectfully quiet. Handshakes followed assurances of follow-up inspections and formal letters to the board. We owe you a debt, the legal rep said sincerely. This could have flooded half the lower street. On my way out through the lobby's glass doors, I passed Karen. She sat alone on a bench, clutching a thin folder, her posture rigid, but diminished, no red coat, no commanding presence. Our eyes met briefly. She looked as if she might speak, perhaps defend or deflect, but instead averted her gaze. No words were needed. The truth hung between us, unspoken. Back in the neighborhood, momentum built rapidly. The emergency board meeting's suspension motion passed, overwhelmingly fueled by a flood of resident emails and petitions. Karen resigned fully shortly after her public statement, citing health reasons and media pressure, though few believed it masked anything but defeat. The interim president, Dale, with his harmless holiday enthusiasm, proved a surprising choice, no expert but a listener willing to learn. He arrived at my door one afternoon with a small delegation, Linda, Dave, and a few others, coffee and determination in hand. Gavin, Dale started earnestly, we've been blind. The board wants you on a new safety committee. Help us make your system official, guide us towards something that actually works. I glanced at my yard where faint traces of old flows were already hinting at natural recovery. I'll join, I agreed. But this isn't just about trenches, it's about accountability, listening to evidence over ego. In the weeks that followed, I became an unlikely advisor. The city looped me into consultations, valuing my field experience. Higher-ups in public works even floated a district-wide citizen task force with me as a founding member. Your data's gold, the director told me over the phone. We need voices like yours preventing, not just responding. But the real change bloomed at home. Neighbors who'd once nodded politely now sought me out actively. We gathered in driveways and garages, poring over simplified hydrology charts I'd printed. I taught volunteers the basics: how to read slope with a simple hose level flag, high-risk spots, install permeable berms without violating new guidelines. The couple from 218 brought thank you cookies. Sharon organized a workshop sign-up sheet. Even the kids got involved, dubbing the sinkhole Karen's Pond in playful whispers, though I steered them toward respect. Laughter mixed with labor as we reopened sealed grates and reinforced vulnerable slopes. Bonds formed in the mud stories, shared apologies offered for past judgments. One evening, as volunteers dispersed after a productive session, Dale clapped me on the shoulder. You know, we thought you were just the grumpy guy with the shovel. Turns out you were the smartest one here. I smiled faintly. Obsession looks strange until it saves the day. The inquiry deepened city auditors, reviewing years of HOA landscaping decisions, insurance claims piling up for the damaged lot. Whispers of lawsuits circulated, but my focus stayed forward, building resilience, one informed choice at a time. Karen's house went on the market soon after a for sale sign stark against her once perfect lawn. I heard she was moving to Vermont, closer to family seeking quieter ground. As the initial shock faded, a new rhythm emerged in Alder Ridge, cautious, collaborative, aware. People greeted each other with genuine questions about drainage, not just the weather. The collapse had been devastating, but it forced open eyes that had been comfortably shut. And in that opening, something stronger began to take root, a community no longer ruled by appearances, but guided by those who'd learned to respect the forces beneath the surface. Validation tasted quiet, not sweet, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt the ground firming not just under my yard, but under all of us. The official reckoning arrived 9 days after the collapse, delivered not with fanfare, but with quiet authority. A large envelope bearing the City of Fair Hill's embossed seal was taped prominently to the community bulletin board near the barricaded rec center, right beneath the warped plexiglass that once advertised pool rules and holiday potlucks. This notice wasn't about trivial infractions. It was a comprehensive citation outlining violations that carried real weight. Neighbors gathered early that morning, drawn by word of mouth, clustering in small groups with coffees in hand as they read the bolded directives. To Aldridge, Homeowners Association. Subject violation of municipal safety and drainage ordinances. In light of the structural failure in the community parking lot caused by negligent modifications to landscape and obstruction of essential runoff pathways, the City of Fair Hill hereby issues a civil penalty of $62,000 for code violations and endangerment of public safety, immediate removal of all unauthorized backfill material, and restoration of natural and engineered runoff contours. Mandatory independent audit of all HOA-approved landscape alterations over the past 5 years. Requirement for all current board members to complete certified flood mitigation and emergency response training within 60 days. Noncompliance will trigger daily fines and potential proceedings for association dissolution. The air buzzed with reaction phones raised to snap photos, voices rising in a mix of vindication and disbelief. "They actually did it," someone murmured. "Fine them for ignoring the obvious." Teenagers on skateboards paused to read one grinning as he quipped, "Guess aesthetic cohesion just got expensive." Even the usual complainers stood silent, absorbing the shift authority had spoken, and it sided with function over facade. For me, standing at the edge of the crowd, with a steaming mug, the notice brought no surge of triumph, only a profound sense of closure. Validation, yes, but tempered by the memory of why I'd fought so hard in the first place. Within 48 hours, the response was swift and unmistakable. Licensed city contractors arrived, not the ones Karen had hired, but professionals with municipal oversight, their trucks marked clearly and equipment calibrated for precision work. I watched from my porch as they descended on my yard, first methodically excavating the gravel that had choked my swales, hauling away the deceptive layer of sod that had hidden the damage. The supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Rios, approached me with rolled plans tucked under her arm. "You're Gavin Hargrove." I nodded. "We're under orders to regrade based on your original designs," she explained, unrolling the blueprints on my picnic table. There they were, my hand-sketched contours from years ago, now professionally digitized, annotated with city stamps and approvals from the Department of Public Works. The gentle curves, the calculated drops, the spillways I'd refined through trial and seasons, all preserved and enhanced. "They're not just restoring," she continued. "The city's designating Aldridge a pilot for residential runoff resilience. Your system's the model expanded across vulnerable zones, with reinforced lining to handle heavier events." I traced a finger over the plans, stunned by the turnaround. They listened. "More than that," she said with a wry smile. "Your documentation made it undeniable. This goes beyond 1 yard. Other neighborhoods are already inquiring." For 3 full days, I observed without lifting a shovel myself, a strange luxury after years of solitary labor. Machines rumbled efficiently, reshaping the earth with purpose, deeper primary channels, permeable gravel beds to filter debris, subtle berms along property lines to guide without disrupting views. Neighbors stopped by, constantly, some to watch in awe, others bearing snacks or offers to help. Dave from 214 lingered longest, shaking his head. "We mocked you for those flags in the snow. Turns out you were mapping salvation." During the process, requests poured in from beyond our streets, emails forwarded by the city from adjacent subdivisions, asking for consultations on similar setups. My phone went silent, except for HOA threats, now carried messages of interest. "Could you review our slope? How do we adapt this for clay soil?" The restoration extended community-wide, sealed grates, pried open, improper grading, corrected under inspector eyes. The parking lot crater remained barricaded, a stark reminder, but plans were underway for proper drainage integration before any repaving. One afternoon, as the crew packed up my section, earth freshly contoured and seeded for quick regrowth, Supervisor Rios handed me a copy of the finalized permit. "Official now," she said. No one can touch this without city sign-off. I held the document feeling the shift, what had been dismissed as obsession, was now sanctioned expertise. The fine hit the HOA. Hard discussions of special assessments rippled through emails, but the audit uncovered more years of questionable decisions, from sealed drains to unpermitted hardscaping that funneled water dangerously. Training sessions were scheduled mandatory and humbling. As the work wrapped, I walked the new channels at dusk, testing the flow with a bucket of water poured at the top. It moved cleanly, swiftly, exactly as intended, vanishing toward the ditch without a stray drop. Neighbors waved from windows, smiles genuine. The ground felt different now, purposeful, protected. And for the first time, the neighborhood's beauty came not from forced uniformity, but from intelligent design that acknowledged the power moving beneath it all. The trenches were back, better sanctioned and shared, and no one would bury them again. Spring arrived tentatively that year, as if the land itself needed time to recover from the wounds of winter. The relentless rains tapered off, giving way to softer showers that nourished rather than overwhelmed. Buds swelled on the bare branches, unfurling into tentative greens, and the saturated ground began to firm, drinking deeply after months of chaos. In my backyard, the restored channels, now deeper lined with resilient gravel and officially permitted, carried occasional trickles with quiet efficiency. A subtle reminder that water could be an ally when guided, not an enemy when defied. The city had left me a full set of the finalized grading maps, along with a framed copy of the new municipal ordinance on residential runoff partnerships, a policy inspired in no small part by the events in Alder Ridge. I hung it in my garage workshop, right beside Alyssa's faded soccer jersey from her last season, a quiet shrine to memory and purpose. With the trenches reborn stronger than before, I no longer worked alone. Neighborhood children trailed me on weekends, eager to learn Gavin's flood tricks, as they called them. We'd stake out contours with bright string and wooden markers, their laughter echoing as muddy boots sank into the softening earth. I demonstrated simple slope measurements using nothing more than a clear hose filled with water, watching their eyes widen at how a few inches of drop could redirect entire streams. See, I'd say pouring a bucket at the top and tracing the flow. Water doesn't fight fair, it follows the easiest road. We just make sure that road leads away from trouble. Adults joined too, drawn by a shared sense of awakening. Sharon arrived with pitchers of iced tea and lawn chairs, settling in to observe before rolling up her sleeves. Dave shoveled alongside me, his steady rhythm a far cry from the frantic midnight digging we'd done during the thaw. Linda ever organized coordinated volunteer schedules and even proposed a community workshop series. Runoff Awareness 101, she dubbed it, with me as the reluctant instructor. We expanded the system thoughtfully, permeable barriers along shared fences, native plants to stabilize banks, reopened municipal grates that gleamed with fresh paint. No home on the street reported even minor flooding that season, not a single soggy basement or eroded driveway. The land healed, and so did the fragile trust among neighbors who'd once been strangers, bound only by proximity. One crisp morning, as I smoothed the edge of a newly reinforced swale, a plain envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, just my name in familiar, precise handwriting. Inside was a single folded sheet. Mr. Hargrove, you were right. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I thought I was protecting this community by enforcing order and beauty. Instead, I let pride blind me to real dangers, to consequences that affected us all. I see that now, too late for some things, but clearly. I've resigned completely from the HOA. My house is sold. I'm moving to Vermont to be near my sister. A quieter life with fewer responsibilities. Thank you for persisting. The neighborhood is safer because of you. Karen. I read it several times in the kitchen, the paper light in my hands. It wasn't a grand apology or a plea for forgiveness. Just honest words from someone who'd faced the mirror and didn't like what reflected back. No bitterness rose in me, only a quiet acceptance. People change sometimes only after the ground shifts beneath them. That same week, Milo, the city inspector who'd overseen much of the restoration, stopped by unannounced. He complimented the volunteer enhancements, nodding approvingly at the native grass seeding along the channels. We fielded inquiries from 4 other subdivisions already, he said. Your template's spreading. Ever think about consulting broader? The department could use someone with your eye. I chuckled, leaning on my shovel. I'm just a retired engineer with a shovel and too many memories. He didn't press, but his parting words lingered. Memories like yours save lives. That's more than most consultants offer. As weeks turned to months, I accepted invitations to speak not just in Alder Ridge, but at city workshops and neighboring associations. I shared the story plainly. The warnings ignored the collapse, the hard-won rebuild. Audiences listened intently, asking practical questions about gradients and soil types. No one dismissed the ditches anymore. One evening, after a particularly rewarding session where volunteers had installed berms along Birch Street, I found a handcrafted wooden sign staked discreetly at the start of my main channel. Simple letters burned into the wood read, "The path of water saved us here." No signature, but the craftsmanship suggested a group effort, perhaps Dave's steady hands, or the kids' enthusiastic help. I left it there, a humble marker of what we'd accomplished together. Walking the perimeter at twilight, flashlight in hand, I listened to the gentle flow in the channel's clean, controlled, purposeful. The air carried the fresh scent of growth, no longer heavy with dread. For years, I'd carried the burden alone, the grief for Alyssa, the vigilance against repeating history. Now it was shared, distributed among neighbors who'd learned to see the land not as a backdrop for perfect lawns, but as a living system demanding respect. Karen's note stayed tucked in my drawer, a reminder that even the staunchest opponents could reflect and release. And as fireflies began their summer dance over the restored yard, I felt a profound lightness settle in. The trenches weren't just defenses anymore. They were bridges connecting past pain to future strength. I was no longer the lone voice warning of storms. I was part of a community ready for whatever came next. As the last traces of winter melted away, spring finally claimed Fairhill with a gentleness that felt earned rather than given. The air softened, carrying the sweet scent of damp soil and emerging blooms, while tree limbs, once stark skeletons against the sky, now burst with vibrant greens and delicate blossoms. The ground, scarred from the thaw's fury, began to mend grass. Seated in the restored channels sprouted eagerly, weaving a living tapestry over the earthen guides that had proven their worth. No more did I wake to the gnawing dread of unchecked flows. Instead, the subtle gurgle of water in the swales brought a strange comfort, a reminder that nature, when respected, could coexist peacefully. The trenches had evolved in my mind from mere defenses to something deeper, symbols of resilience, carved not just into the earth, but into the community's spirit. What the HOA had once buried in arrogance now stood reinforced and expanded, a network that protected every home along the slope. Volunteers continued to gather on weekends, their efforts turning into a ritual of renewal. Kids raced along the contours with sticks tracing imaginary rivers. Parents shared stories over coffee, bonding over the shared labor that had pulled us through crisis. Even the wooden sign at the head of my main channel, "The Path of Water saved us here," weathered gracefully, its letters a quiet testament etched by anonymous hands. One final Saturday, as the sun dipped low in a lavender sky, I lingered in the backyard long after the others had gone home. The air was still and warm, alive with the hum of insects and the distant laughter of neighbors enjoying their evening. I ran my hand along the smooth edge of the primary runoff line, feeling the cool gravel and the firm, purposeful slope. No shovel needed tonight, just reflection. Footsteps approached softly behind me. I turned to see Karen standing at the fence line, in simple jeans and a light sweater, her hair loose and unstyled. She looked smaller in the fading light, unburdened by the weight she'd once carried so rigidly. "I heard this was the last section you were finishing," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the old authority. I nodded, setting down my tools. "It is. The system's complete, stronger than before." She gazed at the channels, tracing their clean lines with her eyes. "They're practical, beautiful in their way. I never saw that." We stood in silence for a moment, the evening breeze rustling new leaves overhead. "I came to say goodbye properly," she continued. "The move to Vermont is soon. A fresh start away from all this." I met her gaze steadily. "Water doesn't care about rules or past mistakes, Karen. It only follows the path allowed or the one it forces." She nodded slowly, a faint smile touching her lips, sad but genuine. "You've taught an entire neighborhood that lesson, including me. I hope Vermont treats you kindly," I offered. "Quiet can be healing." "And I hope you found some here," she replied before turning to leave. Her footsteps faded into the dusk, and with them, the last echoes of old conflict. Alone again, I thought of Alyssa, of her infectious joy, the way she'd roll her eyes at my ditch obsession during her visits, unaware how deeply it stemmed from loving her too much to risk loss again. The flood that took her had stolen a piece of me forever, but in fighting for these channels, I'd reclaimed something purpose connection, the quiet victory of prevention over regret. The water would always come, rains, thaws, storms on the horizon. But now we were prepared, not just with earthworks, but with understanding.